Okay, next up, let's figure out the different ways to declare variables. So here you can see our page is importing main.js, and we're all set to go. Now, you already know how to declare a variable using the var keyword, right? But yeah, you're going to start seeing some other things. You'll see let in the wild, and you'll also see constant. And this can be kind of confusing at first. And really, it's even more confusing because developers don't yet agree on when to use each of them, so people are kind of divided at the moment. Anyways, let's review them, but first, I'm going to show you an example to illustrate why these new keywords exist. Okay, so imagine you have some kind of fire function, and it's going to accept some kind of Boolean so that we can control the flow of this function. For example, if the Boolean we provide is truthy, then I will create a variable, var foo equals bar, and then I will log that to the console. All right, so sure enough, if I were to say fire and pass in true, and in this case I do have live reload turned on, so you see it instantly here, but yeah, I get bar. All right, but what if I were to pass false? And instead, well, maybe we would try to console.log foo anyways? Let's see what happens there. False. Okay, we get undefined. And well, right off the bat, that may not seem overly weird, but imagine we just log some variable that doesn't exist. Okay, well, in this case, this isn't declared anywhere, so we get a reference error. But foo returns undefined. This is very confusing stuff, and one of those core things you have to understand about JavaScript and the way it deals with variables. So if you've ever heard the term hoisting as it relates to JavaScript, this is what that refers to. So here's the deal. When we are using the var keyword, behind the scenes, the declaration, in this case var foo, that actually gets hoisted to the top of the scope. So really behind the scenes, it ends up being more like this. It's kind of weird, right? It's unique to JavaScript. You won't see this with lots of other languages. So it's one of those things you have to understand. So now with this example, it makes more sense that this would return undefined, right? Because it was declared at the top, we just didn't initialize it to anything. So in this case, we set it to bar, and console.log would return bar. But in this case, it wasn't initialized to anything, so we get undefined. It makes perfect sense once we understand that variables are hoisted to the top. Now, on that note, this is exactly why it's considered a good practice to declare all your variables at the very top. Even, once again, if they're not initialized, declare them at the top, and then you can assign them whenever you need to. Anyways, as you can imagine, over the years, this reality, it's confusing for developers. No two ways about it. And it can have side effects that you didn't anticipate. So there's two new keywords, let and constant. Let's first review let. Now, the difference with these two is they are block level declarations. Or when I say block, just kind of think of it as in between the curly braces. So this would be a block. This would be a block. And that would be a block. Now, in this case, if I just bring back var one more time for the example, right here, foo is undefined because the variable declaration was hoisted to the top. However, if I change it to let, well, that hoisting aspect, that never takes place because it's block level. So now watch what happens. We get the reference error, kind of like we would naturally expect. Or in other words, we didn't declare or initialize foo anywhere within this else statement. So really, we should get a reference error. It doesn't make sense otherwise. In order to really comprehend what's going on, we have to learn about hoisting and figure out how that works. So a lot of people really prefer this. Now, this does beg the question, well, when should you use var or let? And once again, developers don't entirely agree on this issue, but at least at the time of this recording, the consensus, or at least the majority of developers, would vote that there's really no reason to use var at this point unless you have a really good use case. Otherwise, you could default to using let, and that would be fine. No problem there whatsoever. But now you might be thinking, well, what about this constant keyword? Does that literally refer to a constant value? For example, a value that never and cannot change? Well, sort of. Unfortunately, it's a little more confusing than that. Let me show you an example. If I were to say constant names equals an array, John and Sandy, and if I were to then console.log names, well, we're going to get the exact same thing. So really, if I were to use var, I'll get it, or let, I'll get it, or constant, I'll get it. So when would you use constant versus let? Okay, well, let's try this. What if I were to say names equals something else? Maybe Frank and Susan. Okay, well, let's try it one more time. With var, it works. With let, it works. But with constant, it does not work. We get a type error. So this could lead you to thinking, yeah, constant just means it's immutable, and that's when you should use it, right? For a value that cannot and should not change, I use the constant keyword. But again, it's sort of the way there, but not entirely. Yes, it's true, I can't assign it to a different value, but that doesn't mean names is immutable in this case. And here's what I mean. I'm not going to reassign it. Instead, I'm just going to alter it. Let's just push Susan here. Aha, well notice I could change it in that case. So that's what I mean when I say it's not 100% immutable. You're not getting that kind of protection here. However, the assignment is immutable. Or in other words, we could say the binding itself is immutable, but the value is not. I can still modify that value. And you see what I mean? It just gets kind of crazy and confusing and weird overall. Even though the keyword is constant, that doesn't necessarily refer to constant values or even immutable values. Instead, it just means this variable cannot be reassigned to something else. So I can't say names equals Joe and then suddenly change it to Frank or something like that. That's not going to work. And that's because in this example, you are trying to reassign it, and that, in fact, is not allowed. So with all that out of the way, when do you use constant and when do you use let? And this is where the community is kind of divided at the moment. A lot of people and a lot of companies have adopted this philosophy. Default to using constant. So if I wanted to set foo to bar, I would default to using constant, like this. The next option is, if you do need to reassign that value and change it later, well, in that case, you would change it to let. So if I have constant name equals Jeff, but later I know I'm going to change it, yeah, with that understanding, this would then become let. And then finally, a lot of people would say never use var again. However, yeah, like I said, people disagree. So some people say, no, you can use var, it's good at the top level. So use var at the top level, but still you would use it pretty sparingly. Next, they would say default to using let instead. So basically most of your vars would change into let, and then finally use constant when you do not want reassignment. So for example, if I had let months equals January, February, I have all the months there, well, I'm pretty sure that will never change, so I would make that a constant. Or in other words, even if it could change, like if I could do months.push, bam, yes, it's true, it's not entirely immutable, but I'm still hinting at something here, right? I'm hinting that even though you can cheat, this should be a constant immutable value. It's almost like a message to the future reader of the code. And even further on that note, a lot of people would say defaulting to constant, well, one, it's 2 characters more, so it makes your code that much less clean to read. You know what? That's more valid than not, actually. And then 2, a lot of people consider it to be almost like premature optimization, where you default to this, so later you have to come back and figure out, well, do I need to change this to let, and what would be the side effects of doing that? That's what they mean when they say it's almost like this small micro premature optimization. And you're doing it to solve something that may or may not be a problem. Were you struggling that much when you were just using the var keyword? I personally wasn't worrying about it too much back then, but yeah, everyone disagrees on this one. So of course, make up your own mind. My personal take has kind of evolved over the last couple months. I originally started with that first example, where you default to constant, and then you switch it to let if you need reassignment. However, in recent months, I've kind of been swayed to defaulting to let instead, and then I only use constant if I'm sure I don't need reassignment. And then finally, as for var, I almost never use them at this point. Like I said earlier, there might be a use at the very top level for some kind of global variable you want accessible anywhere. Otherwise, I don't use them anymore. All right, so keep researching all this stuff, make up your own minds, and when you're ready, we'll move on to the next lesson.